should not pass on to our children and grandchildren the bleak fiscal future that our unsustainable spending is creating. The only way to ensure that Congress acts with fiscal restraint over the long term is to pass a balanced budget amendment. Experience has proven time and again that Congress cannot, for any significant length of time, rein in excessive spending. Annual deficits and the resulting debt continue to grow due to political pressures that the Constitution's structure no longer serves to restrain. In order for Congress to be able to consistently make the tough decisions necessary to sustain fiscal responsibility, Congress must have the external pressure of a balanced budget requirement to force it to do so. The framers of the Constitution were familiar with the need for constitutional restrictions on deficit spending. When the Constitution was ratified, it was the states that had exhibited out-of-control fiscal mismanagement by issuing bills of credit to effectively print money to pay for projects and service debt. As a result of that lack of fiscal discipline, Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution specifically deprives states of the power to issue bills of credit. Over 200 years later, it is the federal government that has proven its inability to adopt sound fiscal policies, and thus it is now time to adopt a constitutional restraint on federal fiscal management.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Conyers, members of the committee, I'm here to make one fundamental point, and that is a balanced budget amendment is a civil rights issue. We cannot protect the voices and the right to representation of future generations if we leave a limitless credit card in the hands of the federal government. The federal government is a radical outlier in that it has no limit whatsoever constitutionally on its credit card, on its borrowing capacity. And that creates a huge potential for abuse of shifting bad policy decisions and the bill, taxation without representation, to future generations. I'm here before you today because a civil rights issue like this should unite everyone. It should not be decided on the basis of any partisan divide. And as a representative of the Compact for a Balanced Budget Commission, the first interstate agency formed to partner with Congress, representing 5 states who have agreed solemnly in a compact to ratify a specific balanced budget amendment, there is finally the opportunity to get this job done. Because HCR 73 was filed today, it is being prime-sponsored by Representative Luke Messer, and unlike any other proposal before you, it only requires simple majorities to pass. It does require yielding some leadership to the states, but that is entirely consistent with the constitutional design, because we've talked about a well-crafted amendment and a well-crafted Constitution, and fundamentally it is about checks and balances, separations of power, and finding a way to ensure that structurally incentives exist that no one's rights are abused. That is precisely what this balanced budget amendment and the Compact for a Balanced Budget is about. It is a well-crafted amendment because it strikes at the core problem. The core problem is not budgetary symmetry. The core problem is not really even budgetary processes. The core problem is limitless borrowing capacity. In 1798, Thomas Jefferson said if he had one amendment to restore the Constitution to its first principles, it would be removing the capacity to borrow from the federal government. Now, that's a little radical. It goes a lot farther than is necessary. But he was striking at a recognition that with limitless borrowing capacity in the hands of any debtor, any human being, let alone an elected official, it is a structural incentive to create fiscal abuse, particularly if you're sending the bill to the next generation. Now, I'm here to urge you today to recognize that many of the concerns expressed by Representative Conyers, by Professor Blinder, and others on, some would say, the other side of the ideological spectrum from me, are legitimate in many respects. It is not the right way to go about fiscal responsibility to have some fixed demand for a balanced budget all the time. But they're wrong in assuming that you can safely place limitless borrowing capacity in the hands of Congress and just hope for pay-go to arise simultaneously. There's a reason why PAYGO failed. There's a reason why it went on and it went off. It's because the pressure to spend beyond our means is unstoppable over time when you have limitless borrowing capacity and you can send the bill to future generations. So in conclusion, I just wanted to emphasize, I'd be happy to take a lot of questions on this. The balanced budget amendment that has been already drafted, that 5 states, Alaska, Arizona, Georgia, Mississippi, and North Dakota have agreed to ratify if and when it is proposed, is designed very carefully to address every concern that has been ever raised about past balanced budget amendments. Those concerns are addressed reasonably, and it is critically important to emphasize that it does what every good constitutional reform should do, which is check and balance power. And with that said, I hope that this civil rights issue of protecting future generations from being saddled with our policy choices and taxes for decisions on spending they never had a chance to influence will be protected, and that we will come to view a balanced budget amendment as akin to the same sorts of amendments we have approved in the past to represent folks that have been excluded from the political process. Thank you very much.
Mr. Dranias, I was especially moved by your analysis that the balanced budget amendment is a civil rights issue, because I could not agree with you more. With all the arguments that say, you know, we want to make sure that we're able to spend to help people, do we not realize that bankruptcy will preclude all of that? And I think that we do face a potential sovereign debt crisis in the near future. And I'm kind of giving a little speech here because I think what you're doing here is vitally important. In all candor, Mr. Chairman, I have signed on to the Compact for America Balanced Budget Amendment approach just recently because I looked it over carefully and I believe it to be the most comprehensive, competent, well-considered approach I've ever seen since I've been in Congress and have been fighting for a balanced budget amendment for a very long time. And certainly want to express my thanks to Mr. Goodlatte for his commitment to this issue for so long. And so what I would like to do is to ask you first 2 questions. One, what is your prediction in terms of the likelihood of having a sovereign debt crisis? And 2, what will it really mean to this country if that should occur?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Franks, if I may. The compact has a sunset date of April 12th, 2021, because 5 years ago, when our team of experts were engaged in drafting the amendment and the approach, and we looked at the exponential growth in the national debt, and we looked at third world countries and how their debt trajectories went, it became very clear to us that 8 to 10 years out, which now is April 12th, 2021, was when perhaps the only real option from a policy perspective might be some form of default. And so you've asked, when is the crisis coming? Our judgment, as embodied in the sunset, in the compact, where it self-repeals April 12, 2021, is this coming soon. And it's coming soon because the level of debt is simply unsustainable. We are now beyond 100% of GDP, where Greece was 7 years ago, if you count all of the debt. And by the way, we don't believe in just counting the publicly held debt. The debt that's being held in the Social Security Trust Fund counts too, unless we're planning to default on it. And so the reality is, it's coming fast, and that's why something like HCR 73, which only requires simple majorities, and yielding some leadership to the states, is what we need to do.
So I guess I would just ask Mr. Dranias, with the time that I have left here, if you would just give us the quick overview of what your amendment does.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Franks, be happy to. First, the amendment fixes the debt capacity, the credit card limit, of the federal government at 105% of what's outstanding when it's ratified. So if we had $20 trillion in debt outstanding on ratification, the credit card limit, so to speak, of the federal government would be $21 trillion. Now that would be a permanent nominal limit. You could pay it down, borrow it back, do what Keynes said we would do, which is borrow it, pay it down in good times, borrow it in bad times, not do what we actually do, which is borrow all the time, right? And the other key component of this amendment, and there are a couple more beyond, is that any further flexibility in this fixed debt limit is not held by the debtor who's got the spending problem. Any additional debt capacity that Congress may obtain has to be obtained by a referendum to the states, reinstating the states into a position of oversight on federal debt policy like they had before the 17th Amendment when they controlled the Senate. And the states would have to approve with simple majorities, not an impossible threshold. 26 state legislatures would have to approve an increase in that debt limit. Now, we don't imagine that that would be utilized all that often because $21 trillion, if we ratified it today, is a lot of debt capacity. If Congress just got the hang of, not borrowing so much, paying it down in good times, living within its means, the opportunities to go to the states hat in hand should be few and far between. But the critical structural component is you can't have, with all due respect, the debtor in charge of deciding what his credit card limit is. There has to be outside oversight. This is a check and a balance. It's more important than any words on parchment. You can have the most wonderful words on parchment, and if you control the words, you're not going to control the problem.
Mr. Chairman, I know my time has expired, so let me thank the chairman, and let me thank you, Mr. Dranias, on behalf of my children. I hope you succeed in all their contemporaries, and I'll do everything I can to help.
Now, I want to talk briefly about Mr. Dranias because he and I have known each other a long time. We've debated this thing for 10 years at least to get back and forth. And I will say that I find his approach to be one of the most ingenious in attempting to try to resolve some of the issues that I think exist in a states-initiated Article 5 process. I would say I could commend Mr. Dranias because I think his is the most assiduous at trying to control and direct an Article 5 states-initiated procedure to a unique end.
I want to move to Mr. Dranias. We obviously have talked about a number of balanced budget amendment approaches, and there's any number of ways to come at this. And we've seen, frankly, a real difficulty in trying to move it forward. The closest we've come, 1995, where we got it passed on the House side, but failed on the Senate side by one vote. Given that difficulty and the different approaches, could you walk us through, and we have about a minute for you, walk us through how the steps to doing the compact, what that entails, and if that is really a realistic approach?
Mr. Chairman,
doable, I guess, doable.
I'd be happy to. Mr. Chairman, Madam Representative, the compact involves two overarching components. One is a congressional resolution activating it, which is HCR 73 filed today by Representative Luke Messer. That only requires simple majorities. It's a concurrent resolution. We've got a good argument against filibuster we can talk about offline. Okay? If that passes, we're done on the Congress side. On the state side, we need to get 38 states, the number needed for ratification, to agree to the compact. We have 5 in. We need to get 33 more. We've got a pretty heavy lift to get it done before 2021, but hopefully the critical mass will be provided by HCR 73.
Okay.
You were explaining some of the elements of your compact, and I'd like to hear the rest of that at this time.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Representative, I really appreciate that opportunity. As we said, there's a fixed debt limit in nominal terms, but there is flexibility. With a referendum to the states, you can increase that fixed debt limit. So if it did become too small from the perspective of a outside oversight committee of sorts, then you could lift it with that consensus. But the key thing is avoiding the conflict of interest of the debtor deciding his own debt limit. Yeah, right. Now, the next couple of features are really great. As you know, with the current debt limit, you get into the midnight hour threat of impoundments all the time. And everyone panics and one side or the other folds. We've built into this amendment a requirement that the president put on his tables any impoundments that he's considering when we get to 98% of the debt limit. And so you'll have at least a couple of months to discuss specific impoundments. And not only that, but to avoid presidential abuses, we give Congress the ability to do a simple majority override by concurrent resolution with impoundments of their own in equal or greater amounts. So this brings the two parties together with specific items to discuss before panicking with the debt limit coming, right? So that's an innovation. And then the other thing we do, and I say this with respect to Congressman Justin Amash, is we do address the tax issue. The reality is debt is taxes. Tax policy is inherent in addressing debt because somebody's going to pay it eventually, and it's going to be through taxes. And the other thing is there is a bias in favor of spending whenever you have debt in a system because it's easier to borrow and spend than it is to tax and spend, right? So you have to balance that disincentive with some sort of tax limit policy. The policy we came up with, we believe, is bipartisan, and it is this. The first part, I think some folks on the left won't like, and that is 2/3 of each House of Congress for any increase in income or other taxes. But then we add an exception, which I think can bring common ground to anyone of goodwill, and that is we preserve simple majorities for anything that eliminates tax loopholes. We preserve simple majorities for replacing the income tax with an end-user consumption tax, and we don't touch tariffs, imposts, or duties. So we preserve the current simple majority rule on the revenue side for the areas of taxation which most economists say cause the least damage. It keeps revenues on the table, but it makes sure we don't destroy the growth we need to keep fiscal responsibility going. So that's the amendment, Mr. Chairman, Representative.